She looked straight into the eyes of her crippled husband, her voice sharp as glass, and said, "I never loved you. I just wanted your money." The words shattered the quiet of their luxurious living room, bouncing off the marble walls like a cruel confession she'd waited years to say. He sat frozen in his wheelchair, the same man who once sold his company to fund her dreams, who still smiled at her every morning as though her love could heal his broken legs. But tonight, under the chandelier he'd bought to celebrate their anniversary, he realized she'd only ever been celebrating herself. Her diamond earrings swayed when she turned to leave, her phone already lighting up with a text from someone who wasn't him. But why didn't he stop her? Why did a faint smile cross his face instead of pain? And what could a crippled husband, stripped of love and loyalty, possibly do that would shock the woman who thought she'd broken him forever? Nathan Cole watched her walk out with the kind of calm only years of disappointment could teach. He'd seen that text name before: Bryce Harlow, a man he once called a friend, a former business partner who vanished when their startup nearly went bankrupt 5 years ago. Nathan had pretended not to notice the late-night messages, the lingering perfume after her supposed business meetings. He'd told himself love meant patience, that marriage meant trust, and that his own disability had perhaps made him insecure. But deep down, he knew something was rotten. He rolled his wheelchair toward the panoramic window that overlooked Lake Haverly. Their house, a quiet mansion on the edge of Connecticut, glowed like the success story everyone believed they were. To the world, he was a retired entrepreneur who'd fallen on hard times. To her, he was a safety net wrapped in weakness. But what she didn't know, what no one in her greedy, gossip-fed circle knew, was that Nathan Cole had built an empire hidden behind ghost companies, shell holdings, and silent investments. His net worth wasn't broken. It was buried. That night, as the echo of her heels faded down the driveway, Nathan pressed the side of his wheelchair and triggered a drawer beneath the coffee table. Inside was a flash drive labeled Harlow Tech Acquisition, Confidential. He smiled faintly, the kind that never reached the eyes. Bryce had taken his wife, but Bryce had also taken a loan years ago, one Nathan had insured was tied to fraudulent corporate paperwork. Every step they took from here would be into a trap he'd built patiently, brick by brick, under the disguise of helplessness. A gust of wind moved the curtains, carrying the scent of her perfume, once intoxicating, now nauseating. Nathan leaned back, remembering the first time he met Elena. She'd been radiant, then ambitious, warm, full of dreams. He'd met her at a fundraiser for disabled veterans, where she'd volunteered to help coordinate sponsors. She'd admired his intelligence, his patience, his quiet charm, or so he thought. But now, those memories played like a highlight reel of lies. The first lie was in her eyes the day she said, "You're all I ever prayed for." The second was in the way she flinched when his accident left him bound to the chair. The accident itself had been no ordinary one, it was a setup. Nathan had learned that much during his private investigation months ago. Someone had cut the brake line of his vintage Aston Martin. At the time, he'd assumed it was a business rival. Now, he wondered if the motive had been closer to home. He wheeled himself toward the fireplace, the crackle of flame reflecting in his calm, steady eyes. His phone vibrated. It was a message from Marcus Delroy, his long-trusted attorney. All assets transferred to the new holding accounts. No trace back to you, Nathan typed back. Good. Proceed with the next step. He looked at his reflection in the window. Tired, scarred, but unbroken. A cripple, yes, but one who'd built billion-dollar corporations from nothing. A man who'd turned pity into power. Outside, Elena's laughter echoed faintly as she got into Bryce's car. The two drove off, unaware of the storm already forming behind those glass walls. Nathan's mind drifted to earlier that evening. She'd made him dinner, steak and wine, candlelight flickering like a performance for their imaginary audience. He'd watched her hands move across the table, steady and beautiful, as she complimented his patience, his kindness. It had almost felt real again until she looked up and said the words that sliced through everything. "I never loved you, I just wanted your money." He remembered the look in her eyes. Not regret, not anger, but liberation. She'd finally said what her heart had screamed in silence for years. And yet, Nathan didn't feel broken. He felt awake. In the quiet that followed, his mind traced back to every red flag he'd ignored: her expensive shopping sprees, despite their financial struggles; her family's sudden interest in visiting when his trust fund rumors leaked; her late-night phone calls answered in whispers. He had recorded everything, every message, every transaction, every secret investment she and Bryce had stolen under his name. The irony was almost poetic. She thought she'd married a weak man, a poor man, but she'd actually married the billionaire CEO of Coal Ventures International, a man whose holdings stretched through technology, real estate, and private finance across the East Coast. He'd hidden it all after his accident, testing her loyalty in silence. And now, the results of that test stood before him, an empty chair where love should have been. He poured himself a drink, letting the silence soak in. The night air outside buzzed faintly with crickets, indifferent witnesses to betrayal. Nathan raised his glass toward the window, where her taillights disappeared into the distance, and murmured, almost to himself, "You wanted my money, Elena. Now you'll drown in it." As he took a slow sip, his eyes glinted not with sorrow, but with calculation. His revenge wouldn't come in anger. It would come in layers, 15 deep levels of it. He would destroy her dreams, her lover's company, their reputation, and the fragile illusion of power they thought they had. He'd take everything slowly, painfully, beautifully, and when it was all over, when the ashes of their greed settled, he would rise just as the cripple they pitied, standing tall in silence. He wheeled himself to the desk, inserted the flash drive, and watched as files opened one by one: emails, bank transfers, intimate photos, contracts with hidden clauses Bryce had signed years ago. Every line, every number, every signature, his tools of war. Somewhere far down the quiet street, her laughter faded into the night. Nathan's lips curved into a smile that promised hell, disguised as justice. The test was over. The performance was done. Now, the real story of Nathan Cole began. Nathan had never liked loud finishes. He preferred a quiet, clinical unraveling. The first strike would not be a scream, but a small, surgical incision. An audit report slipped to the right inboxes, a whistleblower placed at the exact breakpoint, banks quietly freezing lines of credit, while socialites watched the stock ticker bleed. He called Marcus Delroy and listened as the attorney spoke in composed, efficient syllables. Marcus had already arranged for a forensic accounting firm to begin an anonymous review of Harlow Dynamics' ledgers. He had also placed a discreet short seller alert with a boutique firm that loved to dig where reputations were weakest. Nathan closed his eyes and revisited the first time he'd met Bryce Harlow. Fresh-faced, hungry, hands that shook with ambition when Nathan handed him a card stamped with the words, "Mentor." He'd helped Bryce secure seed funding, signed as guarantor on a loan that now, if pressed, would unravel the very scaffolding of Bryce's public image. Nathan imagined the cascade. Investors would panic when regulators sniffed irregularities. Bryce's firm, already thin on liquidity, would call margin clauses and collateral calls. Elena's lavish spending would become a headline. He had prepared for this. Years ago, he'd bought silent equity stakes in companies around Harlow's network, staking options that would flip into control when specific conditions like default were met. It was a game of dominoes Nathan had set up when he was younger and ruthless, then softened by marriage until tonight. The first domino would fall at dawn. He instructed Marcus to feed 2 detailed dossiers, one on Harlow Dynamics' inflated contracts and another exposing a pattern of shell invoices, to a senior analyst at the Ledger, a business journal known for its merciless investigations. The dossier arrived under a pseudonym, backed by bank statements and copies of contracts with forged signatures. The forensics were impeccable because Nathan had spent the last year building them himself. He remembered nights bent over spreadsheets while Elena slept, forging a life of leisure that masked his late-night work. The memory burned not with nostalgia, but with the awareness of how easily he'd been used as a prop. At a gaslit bar across town, Bryce toasted Elena's bright laugh and the promise of a new merger. He didn't see the emails Marcus planted at his counsel's server, a small script set to forward the first sign of inquiry to Nathan's special mailbox. He didn't read the fine print on the loan covenant that, if breached, transferred supervisory rights to a trustee, one of Nathan's shell entities. Pride was a dangerous blindness. The morning the Ledger published the first piece, social media moved faster than the regulators. The headline read, "Harlow Dynamics Under Scrutiny, Inflated Contracts and Questionable Cash Flows." In the comments, people who had once cheered for the underdog now lined up like vultures. Elena's weekend appearances were suddenly dissected for signs of impropriety. Tabloids dug up her charity photos and labeled them opportunistic. Nathan watched the live stream of Bryce's press conference as Bryce rehearsed contrition while his legal team crafted emergency filings. Nathan felt nothing of the petty satisfaction the tabloids assumed he would feel. He felt precise, like a chess player studying a board 3 moves ahead. There were other wedges he'd prepared to pry them apart. Elena's social circle was shallow and surgical. A cousin who owed gambling debts, a brother who had relied on hush loans, a friend who loved the power of proximity. Nathan had quietly approached those peripheral players with offers to settle their secrets, medical bills, gambling ledgers, forged consultancy invoices in exchange for cooperation when the time came. He didn't need confessions on camera. He needed paper trails and a chorus of plausible witnesses who could corroborate the paper evidence about Elena's role in diverting funds and making reckless corporate endorsements. Those peripheral players, now nudged by discreet cash, became the chorus that would amplify the Ledger's story. Yet Nathan's revenge was never only financial. He wanted the public humiliation to align with internal collapse. He needed Bryce to be shown not just incompetent but complicit. He staged a leak of internal emails carefully redacted to look authentic, where Bryce sought assurances that Elena's consulting fees could be masked through a vendor network. The public loved a narrative with a villain who smiled. Nathan made sure the villain smiled in the photos. There was a flashback, quick and cruel. Nathan remembering the night he'd signed the paper that opened the first shell account for Bryce's firm. They had celebrated with cheap whiskey in a cramped office. Bryce had promised loyalty. Elena had smiled like a woman certain of her future. Nathan had been blinded by the thrill of mentorship, the old hunger to create success. Now, decades of that impatience paid off as the strings he'd set tightened. By the third day, regulators had opened an inquiry. Banks began preferring to limit exposure. Bryce's board, feeling the tremors of threatened capital, convened an emergency session. A trustee motion, one of Nathan's scripted clauses, slid onto the docket. Overnight, Harlow Dynamics stock plunged. Bryce's investors called for answers and found walls that led to paper mazes. Elena's siblings were quietly meeting with Marcus, their testimonies folded into declarations they would later sign. Elena, always attuned to image, rallied for damage control. She hired a crisis PR team that spun narratives about overworked executives and accounting irregularities. She posted curated photos, her smiling, a staged family moment meant to reassure. But the internet had a new appetite for the story. A woman who left a man in a wheelchair for a flashy CEO, now accused of siphoning money. The narrative fed itself, outrage and schadenfreude mingled. Elena scrolled through comments late into the night, fingers trembling for different reasons than before. Nathan knew this was only the opening. He had planned 15 layers of escalation, each one surgical, public, bilateral, financial ruin, threaded with personal ruin. This first phase was designed to take away control of companies, of reputation, of credit lines. Without those, Elena and Bryce would have to stand in front of a world that measured worth in solvency and social capital, and they would learn how fragile both could be. As evening sank and Lake Haverly reflected a bruised sky, Nathan watched the news crawl, the words investigation, embezzlement, and resignation flickering across the screen. He allowed himself a small, private flash of what the end might look like. Elena, stripped of curated image, answering questions under harsh lights. Bryce, his empire reduced to bankruptcy filings and whispered contempt. The taste of it was clinical, clean. He reached for his phone and typed one line to Marcus. Keep the trustee motions sealed until midday tomorrow. Let them bleed overnight. Then he closed his eyes and pictured the next domino falling, another move in the long pattern he had set in motion. Outside, a car pulled up near the driveway where Elena once waited for praise. Inside Nathan's house, a man who had been called helpless set the dominoes in motion and watched, with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, as the first of 15 levels of revenge began to unfold. By the third week, the headlines had evolved from scandal to autopsy. Harlow Dynamics faces insolvency hearing. Anonymous whistleblower exposes wire, transfers to CEO's wife. The world loved a rise and fall story, and Bryce Harlow and Elena Cole had become the perfect modern morality play: greed, betrayal, and poetic ruin wrapped in designer labels. Nathan Cole watched from his terrace as morning fog drifted off Lake Haverly. A soft, classical tune played from the speakers beside him. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup as Marcus's voice came through the phone. The regulators are pressing for a full audit. Bryce's counsel tried stalling, but the trustees exercised the default clause. You're effectively in control of the board now. Good, Nathan murmured, calm as ever. Let the lawyers think they're protecting him. We'll let them hang themselves with their own words. Marcus hesitated. There's another development. Elena's family reached out. Her brother, Dean, he wants to talk. Says he has information about her involvement. He's desperate for immunity. Nathan leaned back, a faint smile cutting across his jaw. Send him to my office in New York. No direct contact yet. And tell him there's no such thing as free immunity. He'll earn it. He ended the call and wheeled himself toward the study. Sunlight poured through the tall glass panes, illuminating a photo on his desk his wedding day. Elena, in white lace, looking at him like love itself had a face. He studied it quietly, then opened the drawer beneath and slipped the picture into an envelope labeled Exhibit C. He was building a case not just against Bryce, but against the illusion they'd built together. Every memory would be a weapon, every kiss a piece of evidence. The trap had deepened. Across town, Elena sat in her penthouse suite, her hair disheveled, the sparkle gone from her once flawless poise. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, debt collectors, lawyers. She ignored them all. Bryce paced the room, shouting into his phone. You told me you handled those contracts, Elena. They have emails with your signature, she shot back. You were the one who told me to route the payments. You said it was temporary until the acquisition cleared. Those invoices have your name on them, Bryce roared. You think the SEC cares about temporary? Her face twisted in fury. Don't you dare turn this on me. You think I'd risk everything for you? I left my husband for you. Bryce froze. The words echoed between them like a confession that no longer carried pride, only regret. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that she hadn't left love, she'd left stability. And now, stripped of both, she was dangerous. In the corner, the TV played Nathan's name. Cole Ventures International confirms acquisition of Harlow Dynamics assets through trustee motion. Bryce's voice faltered. Wait, Cole Ventures? That's Nathan Cole's company. Elena turned slowly. That's impossible. Nathan's broke. He can't even walk. Bryce sank into a chair, his face paling. He can walk through contracts, Elena. He owns us. By Friday morning, subpoenas began arriving like funeral invitations. Elena's brother, Dean, signed a statement verifying that she had pressured him to launder funds through a consulting shell under their father's name. Her mother's house was seized after the trust Nathan had once set up for them came under fraud investigation. It wasn't cruelty, it was precision. Nathan had designed each strike to dismantle her support system piece by piece until she stood alone. He knew her greatest fear wasn't prison, it was isolation. That night, she called him. Her voice trembled through the speaker. Nathan, please, we need to talk. He said nothing, just listened. I made mistakes, she continued, tears cracking her tone. I don't know what Bryce told you, but I didn't mean for things to go this far. Please, I'll give everything back, just stop this. His silence stretched. Then, softly. You already gave everything back, Elena. The problem is, it was never yours to begin with. The line went dead. 3 weeks later, the first court date was announced. Coal Ventures International versus Harlow Dynamics et al. A multi-million-dollar corporate fraud case that also carried personal allegations of embezzlement, infidelity, and breach of fiduciary trust. The media camped outside the courthouse. Bloggers dissected every detail. Old photos of Nathan and Elena resurfaced, feeding the narrative of the betrayed cripple who outsmarted his betrayers. Inside the courtroom, Nathan's presence was silent thunder. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, sitting upright in his wheelchair, his composure carved from marble. Elena entered moments later, a trembling shadow of the woman she once was, dressed in a black suit as though attending her own funeral. Bryce followed, pale and sweat-streaked. His arrogance burned out of him. When the judge called the session to order, Marcus began the presentation. One by one, exhibits were displayed: emails, bank statements, contracts bearing Elena's electronic signature, transfers routed to Bryce's private account, shell invoices stamped with her name. Every piece was a brick in the wall closing in around them. Elena's hands shook as her attorney whispered for her to remain calm. But when Marcus presented the last exhibit, a recorded conversation between Bryce and Elena, discussing how to buy off an auditor, she broke. Tears streaked her face, her voice barely a whisper. Nathan, please, stop this. Please. Nathan's eyes never left hers. You told me once you never loved me, he said quietly. Now I'm giving you the one thing you do love: money. All of it. Enough to bury you. Later that evening, as reporters swarmed outside, Nathan's car pulled away from the courthouse. He watched the flashing cameras fade into the distance, then turned to Marcus. Next phase begins tomorrow. File for custodial ownership of their remaining assets. Freeze their joint accounts. Every cent. Marcus hesitated. That'll bankrupt them completely. That's the point, Nathan said. As he stared out the window, the city lights blurred a kaleidoscope of justice, pain, and poetic symmetry. Somewhere out there, Elena was realizing that she hadn't married a crippled man. She'd married a strategist who had learned how to weaponize mercy. And mercy, when denied too long, can become something far more powerful. Nathan closed his eyes, the faintest smile crossing his face. The courtroom battle was only beginning. The deeper layers of revenge were still waiting: personal, emotional, and irreversible. The courtroom smelled of paper and stale perfume, an arena where fortunes were argued like moral verdicts. Cameras waited outside like predators. Inside, the air crackled with the brittle energy of people who had everything to lose. Nathan watched each emotion with the composure of a man who had rehearsed ruin until it felt inevitable. He didn't need to shout. His presence filled the room like a closing door. Bryce, once vivid with swagger, had gone pallid and thin. On the third day of hearings, under intense cross-examination, he began to collapse inward, not theatrically, but with the honest panic of a man who finally saw the legal scaffolding he'd built disintegrate. Marcus produced bank ledgers and vendor lists, then a ledger within a ledger, a chain of shell payments routed through consulting firms that linked directly to Elena's private accounts. The trustee's temporary control gave Nathan, through proxies, the leverage to subpoena emails and call witnesses who had once been too frightened to speak. One such witness was Claire Madsen, a former procurement officer at Harlow Dynamics, hired through a friend of Elena's. Claire's hands trembled as she took the stand, but her testimony was precise. Directives from Elena to approve vendor payments with vague descriptions, late-night messages instructing Claire to route the payment through Dean's consulting firm for speed. Dean was Elena's brother, the same man Nathan had quietly approached with an offer he couldn't refuse. Claire produced documents, screenshots, timestamps, and a voice note that tied Dean directly to laundering activity. The gallery buzzed. Elena's face crumpled, and she reached for her attorney's hand as if to anchor herself. Outside, the tabloid narrative turned vicious. Social media, that relentless court of public opinion, began to stitch a new story. The woman who abandoned a disabled husband for a flashy CEO was now exposed as the architect of a fraud that enriched her lovers and family. Comments that had once sympathized with her now dug at every seam in her life. Elena had always curated an image of generosity and glitter. The curated reality cracked like thin ice. The most devastating moment for Elena came when the court accepted a sealed motion. Nathan filed an order to unseal certain personal records tied to the family's finances and legal signatures. Under oath, a forensic analyst presented an internal timeline showing multiple paternity consultations and financial transfers to private clinics and offshore accounts. Payments that coincided with the conception dates of the children Elena had presented as Nathan's. The implication lay heavy in the room before any words were spoken. Bryce's lawyer, seeking a plea bargain and hoping to spare himself further exposure, cooperated. He revealed testimony that implicated third-party financiers who had courted Elena long before she ever met Nathan. The courtroom, on its feet of evidence, stared at Elena. Nathan watched the color drain from her face as murmurs swelled. The truth, brutal and surgical, was no longer a rumor. Elena's youngest son's birth certificate contained a name that, when cross-checked with bank transfers and travel logs, pointed to an expatriate investor who had flown in during the relevant months. DNA tests were not public yet, but the paper trail Nathan revealed was enough to shatter the narrative. Elena had curated motherhood like she curated brands strategically and with wealthy partners who provided the means. Bryce begged for mitigation. The prosecutor, wary of a messy trial exposing more corporate complicity, offered a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing. Bryce, seeing his empire dissolve and his allies turn, took it. He signed papers on camera, his signature a confession in slow motion. He embraced Elena briefly in the hall, a gesture that looked less like affection and more like the last act of two conspirators attempting to find mercy in public disgrace. Nathan's revenge had never been about bloodlust. It was about correction. He wanted the truth to come out and to hold those responsible accountable. But he also wanted the social currency of power stripped from the people who had wielded it as armor. Elena's family quickly became a slow-motion collapse. Dean, who had once bolstered Elena's lifestyle with loans and ghost payments, was subpoenaed and then arrested for falsifying corporate paperwork after his immunity attempt fell short. Their mother, whose name had appeared on phantom invoices, had her personal accounts frozen and her trust dissolved pending investigation. The social invitations stopped. The private charities rescinded offers. Friends' sudden meters of moral measurement backed away. The press amplified each moment. Photographers captured Elena leaving the courthouse, no smile, no veil of defiance, just a woman who had watched her life unravel in public. The children, shielded from camera flashes by an aunt for the moment, began to whisper questions at home about school, about where the nanny had gone, about why their father looked so tired when he once looked invincible. Nathan had planned for collateral damage to hit where it would hurt most, not only in wallets but in the erosion of the identity they'd relied on. Betrayal isn't merely taking money, it's erasing the story someone told themselves. Late one night, as Nathan reviewed the day's depositions, his phone buzzed. It was a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, showing Bryce in an alley behind a restaurant, bruised and hurried, slipping an envelope into a man's hand. Nathan forwarded the image to Marcus with a note. Begin surveillance on that alley. Identify the courier. He knew the streets carried their own languages. There were people who helped dirty things disappear. Nathan wanted names, not rumors. He also knew the story had turned a corner. The courtroom had given him leverage. The city's whisper network would do the rest. Elena's last bastion image was collapsing, and with it, the social capital that had once insulated her. Nathan didn't relish the spectacle. He planned it with the coolness of a surgeon. He had more moves, reserved actions that would cut far deeper than corporate filings. Reputational devices calibrated to force honest reckonings, custody hearings to challenge parental claims, and finally, a public unmasking that would leave no comfortable corner for Elena to hide. Yet even as he orchestrated the next phase, A different current tugged at him, a small, unplanned variable he hadn't accounted for, one that would reshape the last acts of his plan. On his driver's phone, a text arrived from an unknown number. There was an incident tonight. A man in a wheelchair was assaulted near Dockside. Police report filed. He was taken to Mercy General. Nathan paused. He hadn't been near Dockside in months. His heart skipped not from a fear of losing control, but from the awareness that his physical vulnerability could still be weaponized in ways his calculations didn't anticipate. He picked up the phone and dialed Marcus before he formed the question. The lawyer's voice was steady but laced with urgency. "We'll get ahead of it," Marcus said. "And Nathan, be careful. People bite hard when cornered." Nathan closed his eyes, feeling for a moment the exactness of a life all arranged into moves and countermoves. He allowed himself one thought, soft and oddly human, before he slid back into the armor of strategy. The game will continue, but not on terms I don't control. He tapped a response to Marcus and added, simply, "Start the next phase tomorrow and find out who sent that photo." Outside, the city hummed obliviously, lights blinking like judgment. Inside, Nathan Cole, the man many thought a cripple, readied the next instrument of a carefully measured revenge. One that would not only break them financially, but would leave them unmade in the eyes of the world they had used as a mirror. The night it happened, rain came down in sheets so thick it blurred the city into streaks of silver and fear. Nathan had left the lawyer's office late, the cold air knifing through his jacket as he rolled his wheelchair toward his car. His driver, Terrence, had gone to pull the vehicle around, leaving Nathan briefly alone near the loading dock. The sound of water hitting metal masked the footsteps until they were too close. 3 shadows stepped from behind the dumpsters, faces half covered, voices low and impatient. "He's the one. Finish it quick." The first blow came fast, a crack across his shoulder that sent pain like lightning down his spine. Nathan tried to maneuver, but his wheelchair jammed against the curb. Another hit came, then another. Rain mixed with blood, the world turning to a blur of red and noise. He caught a glimpse of a tattoo, something familiar, before darkness closed in. They left him there, slumped, motionless, the rain washing their footprints away. Hours later, a young woman in a soaked nurse's uniform was leaving Mercy General Hospital. Ava Monroe was on her second job that week, exhausted, her mind drifting between her brother's medical bills and the life she barely afforded. She took a shortcut through Dockside to catch the last bus, her umbrella barely holding. That's when she saw the silhouette near the dumpster, a man, motionless, a wheelchair tipped on its side. Her training took over before her fear. She knelt beside him, fingers searching for a pulse. "Sir, can you hear me?" There was the faintest movement, his lips cracked and trembling. She saw the glint of an expensive watch half covered in mud, the faint burn of headlights flickering across the marble-smooth wheels. Whoever he was, this wasn't some vagrant. She dialed 911, shouting directions into the storm. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Ava noticed something: the look on his face. Even unconscious, he didn't look afraid. He looked determined, like a man dreaming through pain but refusing to yield to it. When Nathan opened his eyes, everything smelled like antiseptic and rain. The ceiling above him was white, humming softly. He blinked against the light. A soft voice spoke beside him. "Easy, you're safe. You've been out for almost a day." He turned his head. A woman sat by his bed, hair pulled back, eyes tired but gentle. She wore the badge of a trauma nurse. "You were attacked near Dockside," she said quietly. "You lost some blood but no fractures. You're lucky." He tried to speak, but pain clawed at his throat. "Who? Found me?" "I did," she said simply. "Ava Monroe." He studied her face for a long moment, steady, unpretentious, nothing of the polished deceit he'd grown used to. "You stayed?" he managed. She gave a small shrug. "You looked like someone who needed someone to stay." Nathan's lips curved faintly. "That's rare." "Maybe," she said, "but it's human." For the first time in years, Nathan found himself trusting silence. The hospital room was plain. No pretense. Ava visited even when she wasn't assigned to his care, bringing books and quiet company. She spoke little of her life, but one night, as rain pattered softly outside, she told him about her younger brother, Eli, who'd been in a wheelchair since birth. "People look at him and only see what he can't do," she said. "But I've seen him build things that walk for others." Nathan smiled weakly. "Then he understands the world better than most." Her eyes softened. "So do you." She didn't know who he really was, the billionaire CEO whose empire stretched across cities, the man who'd orchestrated one of the most ruthless financial takedowns in recent history. To her, he was just Nathan, the quiet man who read old books and listened when she talked. But outside the hospital walls, chaos brewed. Marcus had tracked the attackers. Two of them had criminal ties to a private security firm, once contracted by Bryce Harlow's company. It was desperation now. Bryce had violated his bail conditions, vanishing days after his plea deal collapsed. Elena was under protective custody, claiming she knew nothing about the assault. But Nathan knew the pattern. When rats sense the ship sinking, they bite anything that moves. A week after the attack, Marcus visited Nathan in his hospital room. "We've secured additional footage," he said, placing a tablet on the tray. The grainy video showed the alley, the three attackers approaching, and one familiar car parked half a block away. Bryce's black BMW. Nathan's eyes darkened. "So he still wants to play?" Marcus nodded. "He's out of moves, Nathan, but he's dangerous." Nathan looked toward Ava, who was standing by the window adjusting the blinds. "Then we end this," he said softly. That night, when the hospital lights dimmed and the city hummed in the distance, Ava sat beside him in silence. Nathan finally spoke. "You don't know me, Ava, but what you did, staying when everyone else left, it means more than you know." She smiled faintly. "You don't have to tell me who you are. Sometimes saving someone is enough." He turned his gaze to her, really seeing her for the first time, the quiet strength, the exhaustion that came not from weakness, but from giving too much of herself to a world that rarely gave back. Something in his chest softened, something that had been hard since the night Elena left. For years, he had built walls out of wealth and vengeance, believing no one was worth the risk of kindness again. But sitting there under the sterile glow of hospital lights, Nathan felt the smallest crack in that armor. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe I wasn't meant to be saved from pain, just from becoming like them." Ava looked at him, puzzled but gentle. "Then maybe this is the beginning of that." He didn't answer, but he knew one thing. When he left that hospital, there would be a reckoning. Bryce would face justice not just in court, but in life. Yet for the first time, Nathan's vengeance no longer felt like survival. It felt like closure, and perhaps, if fate allowed, Ava would be part of the peace he had never thought possible. The day Nathan Cole returned to court, the world was watching. Weeks of silence had turned him into myth headlines, speculating on his recovery, tabloids asking if he'd survive to testify. But when the courtroom doors opened and he appeared flanked by his attorneys, dressed in charcoal gray with quiet command in his expression, the entire room stilled. His wheelchair gleamed like armor under the lights. His gaze was steady. "Not angry, just absolute," reporters murmured. "That's him. He lived. He's here to finish it." He was. Bryce sat at the defense table, thinner now, unshaven, his once confident posture reduced to nervous tics. Elena beside him looked hollow, expensive makeup, unable to hide the exhaustion carved beneath her eyes. They hadn't seen Nathan since the attack. Rumors had suggested he was too weak to return. They were wrong. The judge entered. The gallery quieted. Marcus began the final presentation. On the screens, security footage rolled the dockside attack. Enhanced and stabilized, the jury watched as three men cornered a wheelchair-bound figure, their faces illuminated in brief flashes of lightning. Then, the black BMW appeared in the corner of the frame. Marcus paused the video and turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, that vehicle belongs to the defendant, Bryce Harlow. Engine running, doors unlocked, lights off, Cell tower data confirms his phone was active at the location during the assault. These were not random criminals. They were his men, his orders. Bryce's attorney tried to interject, but Marcus cut him off with the precision of a scalpel. You'll have your turn. Right now, we're discussing attempted murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Elena's head snapped toward Bryce. What did you do? She whispered, panic breaking through her voice. Bryce didn't answer. He only stared forward, jaw tight, sweat glistening on his temple. Nathan said nothing. His face revealed nothing. The calm was more terrifying than fury. Then came the turn no one expected. Marcus introduced a surprise witness, Dean Reynolds, Elena's brother, the same brother who'd begged Nathan for immunity months earlier. Now, he took the stand under a cooperation deal that Marcus had drafted carefully, one that would protect him only if he told the entire truth. Dean adjusted the microphone. His voice trembled. It started with the money, he confessed. Elena said it was just business. She said Nathan didn't need it, that he was already rich from the companies he hid under other names. I helped her move the money. She said it was just loans, until Bryce started threatening to expose her. Then she panicked. The room buzzed. Cameras clicked. Dean continued. Bryce said he'd handle Nathan, that he'd make sure Nathan never talked again. Elena didn't stop him. She cried, but she didn't stop him. Elena shot up from her chair. That's a lie. I never. The judge's gavel slammed. Order. Nathan looked at her, calm as a verdict. You didn't need to stop him, Elena. You just needed to care enough to try. She froze, words dying on her tongue. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned, the verdict landed like a blade. Guilty on all counts. Bryce's empire crumbled overnight. His assets were seized, his shares in Harlow Dynamics absorbed by Cole Ventures through trustee conversion. Elena's accounts were frozen, her properties foreclosed. She was ordered to repay the embezzled funds she no longer possessed. And for the final insult, Nathan didn't seek imprisonment for her. He requested something worse, restitution through labor. The court approved a binding clause requiring her to perform supervised public service for the very foundation he'd named in her mother's honor, the Helena Grace Foundation for Abandoned Women. It was poetic, precise, cruel, and just. When the gavel fell for the last time, Elena wept openly, mascara streaking her face. Bryce sat motionless, his attorney whispering about appeals that would never succeed. Nathan simply nodded at Marcus, then turned his wheelchair toward the exit. Outside, the sky was a clear, forgiving blue. Months passed. The story burned through the media cycle, then faded into legend. Another tale of wealth, deceit, and poetic justice. Bryce's name disappeared from the financial pages. Elena's became a cautionary whisper among the rich. The charity she now worked for, Nathan's charity, was thriving. Her shame turned into a public service she could neither resign from nor escape. Nathan never saw her again. He didn't need to. Some endings were better left without confrontation. He sold the mansion by Lake Haverly. The marble floors, the chandeliers, all of it held too many ghosts. He moved to a smaller home near the countryside, where the lake breeze smelled like quiet rather than memory. And there, in the warm rhythm of ordinary days, Ava Monroe found him again. She came by one afternoon with a basket of books and homemade bread, her laughter easy, her presence grounding. He had hired her brother, Eli, as a consultant for one of his accessibility tech startups, a gesture of gratitude that had grown into friendship. They sat on the porch, watching the sun dip low over the fields, the gold light turning everything tender. You never told me what you really do, Ava said, smiling faintly. Nathan's eyes glimmered with mischief. Would you believe me if I said I just invest in second chances? She laughed softly. That's the best kind of investment. They fell into comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need words. For a long time, Nathan had thought revenge would be his only language, that justice could fill the spaces love once occupied. But sitting there beside Ava, listening to the wind move through the trees, he realized something deeper. Vengeance had given him peace, but kindness had given him life again. He reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with gratitude. She didn't pull away, and for the first time since his accident, Nathan didn't feel crippled. He felt free. Weeks later, newspapers printed one last story. Cole Ventures announces major philanthropic expansion. The photo accompanying it showed Nathan and Ava standing side by side, her arm looped through his wheelchair half shadowed by sunlight. The caption read, "From vengeance to vision, the billionaire who chose forgiveness." Elena read that headline from a distance, sweeping the steps of the foundation that now bore her mother's name. Her reflection in the glass doors looked older, smaller, human. For the first time, she whispered, "I'm sorry," though no one heard her but the wind. And somewhere beyond that horizon, Nathan smiled because he didn't need to hear it to know she finally meant it. Justice had been done. Life had moved on. And in its quiet rebirth, love real, uncalculated, unbought, had found him again.